Inside a casket, a wealthy man awakens in absolute silence, realizing he is trapped at his own funeral. From the outside, familiar voices echo, and what he hears transforms grief into a terrifying revelation. Between betrayal, revenge, and a cruel plan executed to perfection, the line between life and death becomes dangerously thin. But even on the brink of the end, a spark of hope emerges, where no one would expect. Before discovering how this shocking story unfolds, don't forget to subscribe to the channel for more intense tales full of twists. The scent of flowers was too intense. Richard Sterling felt it before anything else. That thick, sweet perfume that sticks to the throat, the kind of aroma that only exists in two places, summer gardens and funeral homes. He didn't yet know which of the two he was in. Everything was darkness, a closed darkness with edges, with weight, a darkness that had a ceiling. He tried to move his right hand. He couldn't. Panic arrived slowly, like water rising in a locked room. First came the confusion. Where am I? What happened? Why can't I move? Then came the perception of the space around him, too narrow, lined with satin, with the ceiling inches from his face. And then, the panic became something much more precise, much more destructive. He was inside a coffin. Richard Sterling, 52 years old, founder of the Sterling Group, owner of 3 luxury resorts in the Blue Ridge Mountains, and a real estate empire stretching from North Carolina to Virginia, was inside a coffin. His lungs begged for double the air. He forced his breathing to be slow, calculated, a reflex learned from years of tense negotiations, of meetings where a mistake cost millions. Breathe, think, analyze. This was the order he had given himself so many times in glass-walled boardrooms overlooking the pines of Asheville. Now he needed it more than ever. The sounds came later, muffled voices, the collective murmur of people in mourning, slow footsteps on the wooden floor that he recognized without needing to see. It was the main hall of Sterling Manor, where Vanessa insisted on holding the grand events. The holiday parties, her birthday 2 years ago, and now apparently his wake, Vanessa. His wife's name crossed his mind with a painful familiarity. 8 years of marriage. She was the kind of woman who filled a room, who made men turn their heads, and women search for their husbands' eyes to check if they had turned too. Richard had never been jealous. He was proud of her, of the elegance with which she conducted the social life that his money made possible. But now, inside that coffin, with the smell of white lilies suffocating every thought, he tried to reconstruct what had happened. The last image he held was of a dinner. Thursday night. Vanessa had served the wine personally, something unusual, as she normally left that to the butler. A vintage Cabernet he didn't recognize by the label, but which she said was a gift from an overseas client. He drank it. They talked about nothing in particular. And then a gentle dizziness, almost pleasant, like the beginning of a well-deserved sleep. After that, nothing. And now, this. Richard concentrated all his attention on the sounds outside. There was a religious hymn playing softly in the background, those choral melodies he always found too heavy. There was the discreet clinking of glasses. Someone was serving drinks, so it was a wake with a reception. The kind Vanessa would plan, of course, with canapes and Prosecco, because she never did anything halfway. There was the restrained crying of someone he couldn't identify by voice. And there were, closer than all of that, 2 whispers. 2 whispers that paralyzed him in a way that even the inability to move his body had not managed. Her voice was unmistakable. Vanessa had that slight southern drawl that had never disappeared, even after years of traveling the world. And the other voice, masculine, deep, with an irritating confidence, it took Richard a few seconds to recognize. But he did. Marcus Drummond, Chief Financial Officer of the Sterling Group for 4 years, a man Richard had hired personally, whom he had trusted with the company's most sensitive numbers, whom he had taken to business lunches and introduced to major investors. They were speaking softly, but the coffin acted as a strange acoustic chamber. The words arrived fragmented, but they arrived. "How much longer do we need to stay?" Marcus's voice. "Until the family leaves," Vanessa's voice. "I need to talk to the lawyer yet today. The probate can be started sooner than I thought." A pause. The clinking of glasses again, further away. "Do you think anyone suspects anything?" "Marcus?" And there was a smile in her voice. Richard knew that smile. It had been directed at him so many times. "No one suspects a thing. It was a heart attack. The doctor signed off. The death certificate exists. In 2 days, he's buried in the family plot at Oak Ridge, and life goes on." Richard felt something break inside him. It wasn't physical. His body remained motionless, inert, a useless weight inside that white satin-lined box. It was something else. It was the fabric of a belief he had carried for years, the conviction that he knew the woman he slept next to, that he had built something real, something true, within those walls of the mansion that had cost more than anything else he had ever bought. That fabric tore right there, in that moment, with the scent of white lilies filling his lungs. But along with the pain came something else, equally intense and much more useful. Rage. A cold, methodical rage, the kind that doesn't scream or break things. The kind that plans. Richard Sterling had built an empire from nothing. He had faced bankruptcies, betrayals by partners, economic crises that swallowed entire companies. And in all those moments, what had saved him was not strength or luck. It was the ability to contain the impulse, to breathe deeply within the storm and think clearly when everyone around him was losing their heads. He was motionless. He was trapped. He was listening to the woman he loved celebrate his absence inches from where he lay. But he was alive. And as long as he was alive, there was possibility. There was strategy. There was a way. For now, the way was simple. Listen. Reveal nothing. Don't try to move. Don't make a sound. Don't waste energy he would need later. His body had suffered something. That substance in the wine, whatever it was, had done what they wanted it to do, had perfectly simulated what it needed to simulate. But his consciousness was intact. His thought was alive. And as long as thought was alive, Richard Sterling was not defeated. He closed his eyes, a useless gesture since the darkness was the same, whether they were open or closed, and began to listen with all the attention he had. Every word Vanessa and Marcus exchanged was a brick, and when he got out of there, he was going to build something with those bricks that they would never expect. Outside, the choral music continued. The voices of the wake continued. The distant sound of genuine crying reached him. It was the raspy old voice of Mrs. Higgins, his secretary of 15 years, whom he recognized by the particular way she sobbed, always trying to swallow her tears, as if showing emotion were a professional weakness. She at least was truly mourning. Richard felt something close to tenderness, thinking of the small, organized woman who had managed his schedule with surgical precision for over a decade. Then he felt a pang of guilt, because Mrs. Higgins deserved to know he was alive, and for now she couldn't. No one could. That was the cruelest condition of that moment. He was surrounded by people, some of whom truly loved him, and he needed the most absolute silence of all as his ally. There was also another voice he recognized, Brian Salles, his minority partner and friend of 30 years, with whom he had fished on the coast and shared bitter beers during difficult late nights. Brian had a laugh that shook any room, but now his voice was low, heavy, unrecognizable in its sadness. Hearing Brian like that was the hardest moment so far. Harder than the rage, harder than the betrayal, because Brian was real, the kind of thing Richard had built outside of contracts, a true friendship, without calculation, and he needed Brian now. He needed him more than ever, but he couldn't do anything, not yet. Richard breathed, slow, calculated, and Richard Sterling, given up for dead by those present, continued to weave in absolute silence the beginning of a plan. The transfer took place in the early hours of Sunday morning. Richard knew he was being moved by the swaying, that slow, irregular movement of someone carrying a weight over uneven ground. He felt the coffin being lifted, then placed on a surface that vibrated gently. A van or an ambulance, he imagined, with that smell of rubber and cold metal that penetrated even through the satin. The city was silent at that hour, and Asheville, with its tree-lined streets and fairy-tale architecture, slept as cities that have never seen true tragedy sleep, with the quiet conviction that the world is exactly what it seems to be. Richard wasn't sleeping. Richard had never been so awake in his entire life. In the previous 2 days, while the wake took place at the manor, and later while his body rested in a room prepared by the funeral home, he had learned things no man should learn about himself. He had learned that absolute fear has a specific texture. It's not the racing heart of the movies. It's not the scream that escapes the throat. It's a coldness that descends the spine and settles in the stomach and doesn't go away. He had also learned that the mind, when deprived of movement and physical control, turns entirely inward with an almost painful intensity. And in those hours of darkness and immobility, Richard's mind had done something he never imagined he would be able to do with such clarity. He had reviewed his entire marriage from back to front and begun to see what he had refused to see. The anonymous letter 2 years ago, which he had dismissed as the work of some envious competitor. Vanessa's withdrawal from group events, which he had attributed to the fatigue of an intense social life. Her trips to New York, always with the excuse of visiting her sister, the sister who, Richard now remembered, had called once asking if Vanessa had arrived safely on an afternoon when Vanessa was, supposedly, right there with her. The episode had passed as a mere misunderstanding. Now it had another name, and there was the incident 3 months ago, the one that bothered him most now that the bricks were fitting together. An afternoon when he had returned earlier than expected from a trip to Charlotte, a meeting cancelled at the last minute, and found the mansion strangely silent. Vanessa said she had gone to the lake with a friend. The butler confirmed she had left, but there was a wine glass forgotten in Richard's office, with a lipstick mark he had ignored as a mundane distraction. Now that glass occupied an enormous space in his memory. Now it carried weight. The van passed over a smoother stretch of road, and Richard realized they were leaving the urban area. The trip to Oak Ridge would take 2 hours, maybe a bit more depending on the route. And then, the earth. The finality of earth hitting a coffin, which he had once heard described as the most definitive sound in the world. He couldn't allow it to reach that point. But what could he do? His body still wasn't responding as it should. It had improved marginally. He could now flex 2 fingers on his left hand, a minimal movement that no one from the outside would notice. The substance was losing its effect, slowly, but the process was too long for the deadline he had. And then the vehicle stopped. It wasn't the gradual stop of a traffic light. It was the sudden stop of a startle, followed by voices outside. The driver talking to someone, words that reached him muffled but intelligible. Roadwork, mandatory detour. The van took an alternative route, narrower, and the stretch that followed was of bad asphalt and constant jolts, each one making the coffin slide slightly inside the cargo compartment. In one of the larger jolts, the coffin hit one of the side walls with a dry thud. There was silence for a second. Then the van stopped again. "Did you hear that?" A voice outside, young, a bit frightened. "It was the casket hitting the wall," replied another voice, older, calm, with a thick Appalachian accent. "This stretch is a disgrace. I've told the county 1,000 times. But it sounded like... It wasn't just the thud. It sounded like there was something after the thud." A pause. "What thing?" "I don't know. A different sound." Richard had understood what was happening even before the second man replied. On an impulse that bypassed all his plans for caution, he had flexed the 2 fingers he could move and tapped, twice, weak, almost imperceptible, on the inner wall of the coffin. It was an enormous risk. If the men were employees hired by Vanessa, revealing himself would be the end. But there was something in the second person's voice, that genuine hesitation, that unscripted alarm, that activated an instinct Richard had learned to trust more than any rational analysis, the instinct of someone who had negotiated with people for decades and knew by the texture of a voice when someone was being true. That person was being true. "Stop the truck," said the young voice. "Please, stop." The engine cut out. Richard heard footsteps on the wet grass beside the road, the hiss of a cargo door being opened, a flashlight that made the difference between total darkness and a slightly less total darkness, filtering through the cracks of the coffin. "Caleb," the young voice again, "I think there's someone alive in here." The silence that followed lasted perhaps 3 seconds. For Richard, it lasted a lifetime. "Open it," said the old voice, with a calmness that only the very experienced or the very brave possess. The coffin was opened. The flashlight's beam was a physical assault after days of absolute darkness. Richard closed his eyes with what little muscular control he had. When he opened them again, there were 2 faces over him. A man in his 60s with a white mustache and deep-set eyes that had seen a lot in this life, and a young woman in her early 20s with dark hair tied back and an expression that oscillated between horror and disbelief. Richard tried to speak. What came out was a raspy sound, almost inaudible, more air than word, but it was enough. "Good God," the young woman whispered, and the words carried everything words can carry: shock, compassion, and the immediate resolution of someone who decides in that exact second what they are going to do next. Caleb, the older man, placed his hand on Richard's forehead, felt his temperature, checked his pulse with fingers that knew the procedure. "He's alive," he said with the same calm. "Sarah, call the regional hospital now, and only the hospital, nothing else. No one else. You understand?" The young woman named Sarah already had her phone in hand, but before dialing, she looked at Richard with those dark eyes and said, "You're safe now." They were 3 words, simple, direct, without ornament, and yet they were the 3 most important words Richard Sterling had heard in his entire life, because they contained within them something he had forgotten in those hours of darkness and immobility: the possibility that there were still people in the world who acted for no reason other than it was the right thing to do. When the ambulance arrived 35 minutes later, Richard was being watched over in another way. Covered with Caleb's jacket, with Sarah's hand holding his, on a roadside between Asheville and Oak Ridge, with crickets singing in the dark and the mountain stars scattered above, as if the sky wanted to witness that this had truly happened. The regional hospital in Hickory smelled of antiseptic and burnt coffee, and to Richard Sterling, it was the most beautiful aroma he had ever smelled. He spent the first 2 days in the ICU, hooked up to monitors that beeped with a reassuring regularity, receiving IV fluids and medications whose names he didn't understand, but whose effects he felt with growing gratitude. The gradual return of muscular control. First the fingers, then the hands, then the arms, as if his body were being returned to him in carefully measured installments. His mind, however, had never left. It was lucid, fast, working non-stop, even when physical exhaustion tried to pull it down. Caleb Miller had given the hospital a false name for the patient. The idea had been his, the old groundskeeper from Oak Ridge, with 40 years in the profession and an instinctive understanding that this situation was more complicated than it seemed, had acted with a silent efficiency that Richard could only attribute to a lifetime of dealing with difficult circumstances without making a scene. The name on the chart was Anthony Smith. The town of origin was left blank. Sarah visited every day. She was Caleb's niece, as Richard had intuited from their exchanges at the moment of the rescue. A nursing student in her 3rd year, she was interning at the very hospital where he was admitted, which made the visits natural and inconspicuous. She would enter with that direct stride that practical people have, check the equipment with the professional gaze of someone who is still learning but already knows more than most, and then pull up a chair and sit by the bed. "How are you today?" she always asked with the same objectivity, and Richard responded with the same objectivity, because he had quickly realized that this was how Sarah communicated best, without beating around the bush, without the excess of politeness that is sometimes just a way of keeping distance. On the 3rd day, when he could already sit up without help, and his speech had returned with almost all its previous clarity, he asked her to stay after visiting hours. She stayed. "I need to tell you what happened," he said. "Not everything. Just enough for you to understand why no one can know I'm here." Sarah crossed her arms, not in a defensive sign, but one of concentration, like someone preparing to truly listen. "My uncle already figured it was something like that," she said. "No one wakes up in a coffin by accident." Richard told the minimum necessary: the dinner, the wine, the voices he had heard, the need to remain hidden while he understood the dimension of what had been done and planned how to respond. He didn't mention names yet, an old negotiator's caution that said, "Never play all your cards at once." Sarah listened without interrupting. When he finished, she was silent for a few seconds. "Who knows you're here?" she asked. "You, your uncle, the doctors who treated me and who, it seems, accepted Caleb's explanation without asking questions." "Dr. Henderson is like that," she said, with something that was almost a smile. "He treats who needs treating and doesn't ask questions that aren't his business. It's a rare quality." "It's the most valuable quality in the world right now," Richard said. There was a pause, and then Sarah said something he didn't expect. "Do you have someone you trust absolutely out there? Someone who has no connection to your company or your wife?" The question was too precise to be a coincidence. She had thought about this. Richard thought of Brian Salles, Brian who had fished with him and who cried at a wake while the widow drank Prosecco, Brian who had his own construction company, completely separate from the Sterling Group, Brian whom Richard had met at 22 in a boarding house in Raleigh, before the money, before the mansion, before everything. "I do," he said. "Then we need to reach that person without leaving a trace." The "we" was a deliberate choice of word, and Richard noticed it. The dark-haired girl who had held his hand on a roadside had just placed herself inside that situation, not out of naivety, but by decision. This moved him more than anything else had managed to move him in those difficult days. "Why are you doing this?" he asked directly. She didn't look away, because when my uncle said there was someone alive in that casket, the first thing I thought was that it was impossible. And the second thing I thought was, then what are we going to do to help? She paused briefly. "It's not that complicated, you know. Sometimes the right thing is simply the right thing." Richard was silent for a moment. Then he said, "You know this could get very complicated. There are people involved with a lot of power and a lot of interest in me staying gone." "I know," Sarah said, "but my uncle is 72 and looks after a cemetery in Oak Ridge, and I'm 24 and in nursing school. We're not exactly anyone's target." It was true, and that was exactly why they were, at that moment, the two most valuable allies Richard Sterling could have. The next morning Caleb showed up with an old burner phone, the kind that didn't have app tracking, that only made and received calls. He put it in Richard's hand without saying anything, gave him a pat on the shoulder, a gesture that said more than many words, and left. Richard stared at the device for a long minute. Then he dialed a number he had memorized decades ago, because he was the kind of person who memorized important numbers instead of delegating that to machines. Brian answered on the second ring, as he always did for Richard, even when the number was unknown. "Hello?" "It's me," Richard said. The silence that followed lasted exactly 4 seconds. Then came Brian's voice, lower than usual, more controlled than Richard had ever heard it. "I'm listening." And in the next 2 hours, Richard Sterling told the whole story, this time without sparing details. Because Brian Salles, with his 30 years of friendship and his construction company entirely separate from the Sterling Group, was exactly the kind of ally a situation like this demanded, someone who had nothing to gain or lose from the outcome, except what had always mattered between the two of them, since that boarding house in Raleigh: the truth and the loyalty that comes with it. Brian was silent for a while after Richard finished. It wasn't the silence of empty shock. It was the silence of someone organizing what they heard, separating emotion from data, internally mapping the problem. Richard knew this silence. It was the same one he used. "How much time do you need?" Brian asked at last. "Enough time to recover and understand what Marcus did with the company numbers. It wasn't just the marriage. I'm sure there's something in the financial records I didn't see because I trusted him." "I can check that," Brian said slowly. "I have an accountant who's worked for me for 20 years, discreet as a brick wall. If there's something in the group's books, he'll find it without needing to walk through the front door. You can't use the group's name in any inquiry." "Richard," and there was a soft tone of reproach in his friend's voice, almost affectionate, "you've known me for 30 years. Give me a little credit." Richard felt something loosen in his chest. It was as simple as that. The voice of a man who knew him before everything, who knew who he was before the money and continued knowing now, with him lying in a hospital bed with a fake name on the chart. Simple as that, and yet as rare as gold. "Thank you," he said, putting into those 2 words everything he didn't have the vocabulary to say otherwise. "Don't thank me yet," Brian replied. "Thank me when it's over. Take care of your health, and don't disappear again." Vanessa Sterling was a flawless widow. Brian Salz watched her for 3 weeks, from the safe distance that the discreet cameras installed by a former employee of his made possible, and came to the conclusion that she had rehearsed this role with the same care she had rehearsed all the others over the years. Vanessa's mourning had the texture of a magazine editorial, the well-tailored dark dresses, the makeup that suggested dark circles without actually producing them, the gesture of passing her hand over Richard's photo at the entrance of the manor every time there were visitors. It was convincing, for someone who didn't know what they were looking at. Brian knew. He reported everything to Richard via calls from the untraceable phone on Tuesdays and Fridays, fixed times they had agreed upon with the precision of a ritual. Richard listened, took notes in a notebook Sarah had brought, and it was through these reports that the picture became clear with a sharpness that hurt. Vanessa had dismissed the butler 20 days after the wake, an unexpected firing for those who knew the man, who had served the Sterling family for 12 years. Marcus Drummond had taken up an office inside the mansion under the pretext of handling probate matters, which was partially true. He was handling matters, but not in a way any legitimate judge or lawyer would approve. And there was something else, something Brian had discovered by chance and had saved for the right moment to tell, because he knew that when he told it, Richard would need to be steady enough to hear it without breaking. He told him on a Friday 3 weeks after the first call. "Richard," he said with that tone that indicated what came next was important, "I need to tell you something about Vanessa, about who she is, who she was before." "Go on." "The accountant I hired to look at the group's books found an irregularity that isn't financial. It's in her documents, in the process of opening your joint account 8 years ago. The name she used was real, but there were documents from a previous case in Florida. A civil lawsuit from nearly 15 years ago." Richard went quiet. "What kind of lawsuit?" "She was married before, to a man named Henry Barrett, industrialist, textile sector. She tried for a probate while he was still alive, through a power of attorney the husband claimed was forged. The case was settled. She signed a non-disclosure agreement and left with a settlement. Henry Barrett is still alive, living in Palm Beach, and never remarried." The silence that followed was long. Richard had thought he knew the size of the betrayal. He had spent weeks in the hospital, and then in a house Sarah rented on the outskirts of Hickory, mentally reconstructing every episode of the marriage under the new light of what he had discovered. He had thought he had reached the bottom, but the bottom had another flaw. "She's done this before," he said, not as a question, but as confirmation of what logic always implies. Patterns repeat. "With Henry, it didn't reach the point it reached with you," Brian said, "because Henry was more skeptical from the start, or had more luck, or both. But the structure is the same. Gradual entry into the life of a wealthy man, building a relationship of trust, attempting access to the estate." "And Marcus?" "Marcus Drummond appears in Vanessa's story long before you hired him. They've known each other for at least 6 years. His hiring for the group wasn't a coincidence, Richard. It was part of the plan." That was the missing piece. Richard had been wondering how Vanessa, alone, would have access to the right substances, to the doctor who signed the certificate without questioning, to the logistics of everything that had been executed with a precision that seemed too professional for improvisation. The answer was that it hadn't been improvisation. It had been a project of 2 years in the making. He lay in the room of the rented house, a simple room with a window overlooking a backyard with a peach tree, and stared at the ceiling for a while. Sarah was in the kitchen. He heard her footsteps on the tile floor. She had become a regular presence in those weeks, unintrusive, never more than necessary, but there, in a way he had begun to recognize as essential without being able to name exactly why. She brought medicines, checked the progress of his recovery, sometimes stayed, and they talked about small things, the town, nursing school, Caleb and his stories from 40 years tending a cemetery. Richard had realized with some surprise that it was in these moments of small talk that he felt the tension leave his shoulders, not in the calls with Brian, where there was always the urgency of planning, not in the moments of analysis and strategy, but there in that simple kitchen, listening to Sarah talk about something of no strategic importance whatsoever. It was a kind of relief he had forgotten existed. That night, after he had processed what Brian had told him, he got up and went to the kitchen. Sarah had a book open at the table, Anatomy, he saw by the cover. "Can I sit?" he asked. She made a gesture that was a yes, without taking her eyes off the page. Richard sat on the other side of the table and was silent for a moment. Then he said, "She did this before, with another man. It's part of who she is." Sarah closed the book. "And how are you with that?" It was a direct question, without the wrapping of sympathy people usually put around difficult questions. It was the question itself, naked, waiting for an honest answer. "I'm processing it," he said with the same honesty. "There's a part of me that wanted it to be personal, that it was about me specifically, about a real grudge she had or something I did, because at least then there would be a human logic. But if it's a pattern, if I was just another case in a sequence, then what I thought was my marriage never truly existed, and that's harder to process than anything else." Sarah was silent for a few seconds. "You existed for real," she said at last. "What you felt existed. What she built didn't. Those are different things." It was a simple distinction, but it was exactly the distinction he needed to hear, and in that moment, coming from that 24-year-old woman who had carried him out of a coffin, with the calm strength of someone acting without calculating the cost, it was enough for him to sit a little firmer in his chair. The plan was taking shape. A few pieces were still missing. Concrete evidence, the testimony of the doctor who had signed the certificate, the forged documents Brian had mentioned as a possibility. But Richard Sterling had built an empire with less than that. He had learned to work with what he had, to be patient when patience was the right strategy, and to wait for the moment when the cards could be laid on the table with maximum effect. That moment was coming. He felt it in his bones, the same bones that had been motionless for days and now carried once again the weight of a man who knew exactly what he wanted to do next. The doctor's name was Dr. Alden Vance, and he had signed Richard Sterling's death certificate through a combination of money and fear that, when decomposed into its parts, was less astonishing than it would seem at first glance. Brian discovered this through a tortuous path that took 2 weeks and involved the discreet accountant, a former employee of the clinic where Vance practiced, and a bar conversation that had started casual and ended revelatory. The doctor had received a proposal from Marcus Drummond 6 months before the wake, a generous financial offer that was also an invitation to a complicity from which, once accepted, there was no easy exit. Marcus had been careful enough to create records of that acceptance in ways he could use against Vance if necessary. He was a man who liked guarantees. Richard heard all this sitting at the kitchen table of the rented house, with his notebook open and pen in hand, in a posture identical to the meetings he had chaired for decades. That total attention that seemed calm on the outside and was an engine at maximum rotation on the inside. "Vance knows he's in an untenable position," Brian said. "If the situation goes public, he loses his license. But if someone offers him a way out, a way to cooperate without completely destroying himself, there's a good probability he'll take it." "Who makes that offer?" Richard asked. "I have a lawyer," Brian said. "Arthur Light, from Light & Associates in Charlotte. He's worked with me for 8 years, discreet as a wall, like all the useful professionals I know." Richard considered for a moment. "When can you talk to him?" "I already have," Brian said, with that specific quality of someone who is always 2 steps ahead of the conversation. "He's waiting for your approval to move forward." Richard almost smiled. In 30 years, Brian Salz had never changed. He was the kind of man who handled the logistics before confirming the plan, because he understood that time was always the scarcest resource. "Approved," Richard said. "But I need Arthur to understand one thing clearly. No one gets to Vance before I have everything I need from the financial records. I want to know exactly what Marcus moved, when he moved it, and how. The doctor is the last piece, not the first." "Understood." The accountant had found in the Sterling Group's books what Richard suspected, a series of transfers scattered into shell company accounts, started 18 months before the wake, accumulating a value that, when summed up, represented approximately 12% of the company's net worth. It wasn't catastrophic. It was surgical. It was enough for Marcus to establish himself comfortably while waiting for the formalization of the probate, without raising immediate alarms in the balance sheets. Richard had sat with those numbers for 3 days, reviewing every line, reconstructing every operation with the photographic memory that had been his most powerful tool in business. And at the end of those 3 days, he had reached a conclusion that was both obvious and painful. Marcus had learned the company's patterns over 4 years of privileged access to data. He had used that knowledge with a competence that, in other circumstances, Richard would have admired. That was the worst kind of betrayal, the kind that used as a weapon exactly what you had given of good. On a Thursday afternoon, while Brian was in a meeting and Sarah was at the hospital, Richard was left alone in the house for the longest period he had been since his recovery. It was a different loneliness from the coffin. This was a loneliness with windows, with light entering through the yard, with the peach tree, with the sound of a bird that had decided to live on the fence and sang at the same time every day. And in that loneliness, for the first time since he had awakened at the wake, Richard Sterling allowed himself to feel without analyzing. He felt the exhaustion, not the physical one, which had subsided in the second week of recovery, but the other one, of carrying for years a version of the world that was wrong. He felt the shame, not of having been deceived, which he had quickly recognized as unfair, but of having ignored signals that were there, that had asked for attention, and that he had dismissed because trusting was more convenient than doubting. He felt also something he didn't expect to feel: relief. A strange, almost unseemly relief to be out of the manor, out of the social obligations and the dinners and Vanessa's events, out of the entire structure he had built and which, realizing now with clear eyes, had begun to weigh in a way he had attributed to business stress, but was something else. It was the dissonance of living in a place that looked like home but wasn't. That simple house in Hickory, with the peach tree and the bird on the fence, was more home than the mansion had been in the last 2 years. It was an uncomfortable thought. He tucked it away carefully and continued. When Sarah arrived from the hospital in the late afternoon, he was sitting on the porch with the notebook, but he wasn't writing. She stopped at the door, looked at him with that clinical attention that had become a habit, and said, "Hard day?" "Necessary day," he replied. She nodded, as if the distinction made perfect sense, which it did, for someone who had learned the difference between what hurts because it's wrong and what hurts because it's right. "There's news," she said, swapping her shoes for slippers with the efficiency of someone who had arrived home. "My uncle heard, from one of his contacts in Asheville, that Vanessa is moving to speed up the probate process. Her lawyer filed a request for an expedited timeline, claiming business continuity issues." Richard put the pen in the notebook. "She's in a hurry." "She is," Sarah confirmed, "which means the time you have is shorter than you planned." He was silent for a moment, looking at the yard where the afternoon light gilded the leaves of the peach tree. "Then it's time to accelerate," he said, and the tone was calm, resolved, without anxious urgency. It was the tone of the man who had learned, inside a coffin, that panic wastes the most precious resource of all: clarity. "Talk to Brian. Tell him we need to set the meeting with Arthur Light for next week, and that the time has come for me to exist again." Sarah stood in the doorway for a second before going in. "When you start existing again," she said, choosing her words carefully, "it's going to be different. People are going to react in ways you can't completely predict, even the ones closest to you." "I know," he said, "and it will need to be fast. There's no room for hesitation once it happens." "I know that too." She nodded once and went inside. Richard remained on the porch, listening to the bird on the fence, which sang until darkness closed completely over the yard. It was a bird with no hurry. It sang because it was what it knew how to do, regardless of who was listening. There was something of an instruction in that. The next morning he called Brian before the scheduled time. "I need Arthur Light to prepare a preventative document," he said without preamble. a petition to annul the legal acts practiced after the death certificate, based on the irregularity of the certificate itself. I want it ready before the meeting, not after. You're speeding up because she's speeding up, Brian said. I'm speeding up because the plan is complete, Richard replied, and because staying still when the plan is complete is wasting an advantage. Right. I'll talk to Arthur today. Richard hung up and went to the bathroom, stared at his own reflection for a time he couldn't measure. He had aged in these weeks, not in the obvious way, but in a subtler manner, a new firmness in his gaze, as if the experience had burned away what was superfluous and left only the essential. Richard Sterling was back. Different, heavier in some places and lighter in others, but back. And it was time for the world to know it. The meeting with Arthur Light took place on a Tuesday afternoon, in a discreet office in Charlotte, that the lawyer kept for clients who preferred not to appear at the main address. He was a man in his 50s, thin with wire-rimmed glasses and a way of listening that made a person feel that every word was recorded and weighed with precision. Brian had described him well. He was the kind of lawyer who doesn't make unnecessary promises and isn't easily impressed. When Richard entered wearing a baseball cap, with the beard that had grown during the weeks of seclusion, sufficiently different from the face that appeared in public records, Arthur merely nodded as if the situation were just another entry in a complicated schedule. "Mr. Salles briefed me on the essentials," he said after the greetings, "but I need to hear a few points from you directly before defining the strategy." "Ask away," Richard said. "The death certificate was issued with the cooperation of the doctor, whom you identified as Alden Vance. Is there any other person with sufficient technical knowledge to question the certificate who could testify in your favor? Dr. Henderson from the regional hospital in Hickory can confirm my clinical state at the time of admission. He doesn't know my real name yet, but when he does, I think he'll cooperate." Arthur noted it down without comment. "The financial documents, the records of the transfers to shell accounts, who has access to them now?" "Brian's accountant. They are in secure copies outside the company servers." "Good." Another note. "And the recordings of the conversations at the wake. You heard them, but you didn't record them. There is no direct record." "No," Richard admitted, "but there are the depositions of Caleb and Sarah, who rescued me, and there is the history of the Florida case, which documents a previous pattern of behavior." Arthur was silent for a moment, the kind of silence that indicates the brain is working at a speed the conversation can't keep up with. "The weak point is exactly that," he said at last. "Without a recording of the conversations at the wake, the defense will argue that you were in an altered state of consciousness when you heard them, that there were no physical conditions for adequate perception. They will question the reliability of what you report having heard." Richard had thought of that. He had thought about it for days. "Then we need them to repeat it," he said. Arthur looked up from the notepad. "Repeat it." "Vanessa and Marcus need to say again what they said at that wake, in conditions that can be recorded." Richard leaned slightly forward. "Is it possible to construct that?" The lawyer was silent for a while. Then he said, with the caution of someone choosing every word, "It's possible, if the situation is constructed so that the initiative comes from them, a meeting where they feel safe, where they believe they are speaking without witnesses, and if there is someone trustworthy on the inside." The three of them looked at Brian. "No," Brian said immediately. "It's not me. They know I'm Richard's friend. If I show up wanting to talk to Vanessa about the probate, she'll be suspicious." "Then it needs to be someone she doesn't associate with me," Richard said. It was Sarah who proposed the solution later, when Richard reported the meeting by phone. "Mrs. Higgins," she said, with that characteristic objectivity. "The secretary." Richard was silent for a second. "She's 70 years old." "She's 70 years old, worked for you for 15 and was devastated at the wake. Vanessa will never suspect her. And if Mrs. Higgins knows you're alive, I think she'd do anything to help." It was true. Richard knew it was true even before he finished processing the argument. He knew Mrs. Higgins well enough to know that her loyalty wasn't that of an employee to a boss. It was the rarer loyalty of a person who recognizes in another a character that deserves protection. The conversation with Mrs. Higgins took place 2 days later in a coffee shop in Hickory. Brian picked her up in Asheville with the excuse of a pending company document, an excuse she accepted without question, because Mrs. Higgins was the kind who doesn't question pending documents. She resolves them. When she walked into the cafe and saw Richard sitting in a corner, she stood completely still for an instant. Then she went to the table with steps that tried to be normal and failed, and when she sat down, the hands she placed on the table were visibly shaking. "Richard," she said, in a voice so low it was almost without sound. "Mrs. Higgins," he said with the same softness. She cried in silence for a moment. Then she wiped her eyes with that efficiency she applied to everything, straightened her back, and said, "What do you need me to do?" Richard felt a gratitude that had no adequate name in any language. He explained the plan carefully. Mrs. Higgins listened without interrupting, as she had always listened to the most complex briefings with that total focus that was her trademark. When he finished, she was silent for a few seconds. "Vanessa will see me," she said. "She always liked me because I never gave her a reason to be suspicious. I never gave an opinion on the marriage, never stuck my nose where it wasn't called for. To her, I'm an old employee who lost her job with the probate and who wants to know about her severance and benefits." "That is exactly the pretext," Richard confirmed, "and when she starts talking—" Mrs. Higgins opened her purse, took out her own cell phone, and placed it on the table with a precision that made Richard almost smile. "I'll leave this recording inside my bag, just like Mr. Sal's taught me." Brian raised his eyebrows, slightly impressed. "She's a quick study," he murmured. "I worked for Richard Sterling for 15 years, Mrs. Higgins said, with a dignity that ended the matter. "I learned from the best." The plan was complete, every piece in place. All that was missing was the execution, that moment when chess stops being theory and becomes real movement, with real consequences for all sides of the board. Richard paid for the coffee, left with Brian through the back of the establishment, and didn't look back. The time had come when looking back would be a waste. What mattered was ahead. That night, back at the rented house, Richard stayed up late. Every piece of the plan was where it should be. Arthur Light, with the documents ready for immediate filing. The accountant with the records of the transfers catalogued. Dr. Henderson had confirmed he would cooperate when the time came, and Mrs. Higgins, with 70 years of life and 15 of loyalty, about to enter the mansion where Vanessa feigned mourning. Sarah appeared in the doorway with 2 glasses of water, placed one on the table without asking, and sat on the sofa across the room. They were silent for a while, the kind of comfortable silence that only exists between people who've been in difficult enough situations not to need to fill the space with words. "Tomorrow it begins," Richard said eventually. "Tomorrow it begins," she confirmed. "You didn't need to get so involved. From the start, you did more than anyone would have reason to do." Sarah stared at the glass in her hand for a second. "When my uncle opened that casket," she said, "I saw a man who was alive when he shouldn't be, lucid when anyone would be in collapse, and who, before anything else, looked at us and tried to evaluate if he could trust us." She raised her eyes. "That kind of person deserves to make it to the end." Richard didn't respond immediately. There was more than solidarity in those words. There was a recognition that rarely happened without people having shared something real, something that cost them. "Thank you," he said. And this time the word carried a different weight, not the urgent weight of survival, but the quieter, more permanent weight of a debt that cannot be paid with money. Sarah nodded and went to her room with the same direct stride as always. Richard stayed awake a little longer, listening to the silence of the town around him, a town that didn't know he existed, that had lived its normal days while he rebuilt the world in that small house with the peach tree in the yard. Tomorrow it began, and this time Richard Sterling would be on the outside of the coffin. Mrs. Higgins arrived at Sterling Manor on a Thursday morning with a folder of documents under her arm and her cell phone at the bottom of her bag, on and recording. Vanessa received her in the living room, the same room where she had served Prosecco at the wake, now rearranged with fresh flowers and a different arrangement of pillows, small marks of the woman making the space her own. She wore a dark blue blouse, not full mourning, but still within the palette the widow narrative demanded. Her hair was done, and her eyes were slightly tired in a way Mrs. Higgins immediately recognized as calculated. "Mrs. Higgins, how good to see you. Come in, sit." Vanessa's tone was that of someone receiving an expected visitor, but one of secondary importance. "You said it was about the severance?" "It is," said Mrs. Higgins with her usual calm voice, without any sign of the 15 years she had spent learning when to speak and when to be silent. "But there's also something I'd like to understand better, if you'll allow me." Vanessa adjusted her position in the armchair, signaling she was listening. "I know the probate is moving along," Mrs. Higgins continued, "and I know Mr. Drummond is helping with that. I just wanted to understand if my years of service will be recognized the right way, with the priority the law guarantees." "Of course they will," Vanessa said, with a softness that was exactly the right size to be kind without being too effective. "You know I always respected your dedication to Richard. We'll resolve this properly." The mention of his name. Mrs. Higgins had been instructed to hold back her emotion at this moment, and she did. But inside, something tightened with a force that only 30 years of life had taught her not to show. "I know," she said. "You know I miss him very much. He was a rare man." "He was," Vanessa said. And then, in a variation of tone so small that anyone without 15 years of practice in observing details would have missed it, she added, "He was a difficult man too sometimes, but you have to respect that, right?" Mrs. Higgins nodded slowly. Difficult how? It was the invitation, simple, neutral, without pressure, and Vanessa, who had rehearsed the character of the widow with such care that she had begun to confuse the rehearsal with the performance, accepted the invitation with a naturalness that confirmed how much she needed to talk to someone, anyone who wasn't Marcus. "Oh, you know how he was. Suspicious, with that habit of checking everything, of not trusting even those closest to him." Vanessa looked at the window, as if seeking the right expression on the horizon. "I tried to be the wife he needed, but there comes a time when you realize you'll never be enough for certain men." "I understand," Mrs. Higgins said, "and so you look for what's missing somewhere else." Brief pause. "It's not an excuse, but it's life." The recording was happening. Mrs. Higgins felt the weight of the cell phone at the bottom of her bag as if it weighed 20 pounds. "Yes," she said with all the calm she had in reserve. "Life is complicated indeed." Marcus Drummond appeared in the living room doorway without warning, that specific way of someone who has become accustomed to circulating in the space as if it were his own, which it wasn't yet, but which he had already decided it would be soon. He saw Mrs. Higgins and hesitated for a fraction of a second. That hesitation most people don't notice, and good observers never miss. "Mrs. Higgins," he said, neutral. "Mr. Drummond," she replied with the same neutrality. There was a moment of adjustment in the room, that silent reorganization that happens when a third person enters a conversation of two and realizes they interrupted something. Marcus looked at Vanessa with a brevity that communicated a question. Vanessa responded with a brevity that communicated everything was fine. "I'll let you finish," Marcus said, and left. Mrs. Higgins stayed another 20 minutes. She didn't force anything, didn't push any door Vanessa wasn't already opening. She handled the documents with her usual efficiency, thanked her, said goodbye with the protocol hug the situation demanded, and left through the same door she had entered, with the cell phone recording all the way to the gate. 3 hours later, the audio file was in the hands of the lawyer, Arthur Light, who listened twice and then was silent for a moment. "It's not a direct confession," he said to Richard and Brian, who were waiting in the boardroom of the discreet office, "but it's consistent with everything else. Combined with the financial records, Vance's deposition, and the hospital chart, it establishes a picture that any judge will take seriously." "Is it enough for what we need?" Brian asked. "To start the process of nullifying the certificate and all subsequent acts, yes." Arthur took off his glasses and cleaned them in a deliberate gesture. "But the most important part hasn't happened yet." Richard knew which part he was referring to. He had thought about it in every free moment of the last few weeks, in the late nights when sleep wouldn't come, in the moments on the porch with the peach tree, in the conversations with Sarah that sometimes got too close to this subject for him to feel comfortable. The moment he would appear before Vanessa. Not for revenge. Richard had examined that motive carefully, disassembled and reassembled it in the 40 days since he had awakened inside a coffin, and reached the conclusion that revenge was not the right word and never had been. What he wanted was simpler, and at the same time more demanding than revenge. He wanted the truth to exist. He wanted what had happened to be recorded, documented, real, not in the version Vanessa had built, but in the version that actually was. "When?" he asked. "Next week," Arthur said. "Let me file the first documents. When the case enters the system, they will be notified. And when they are notified, they won't know what to expect. That is the moment." Richard nodded. It was the moment. It was arriving with the inevitability of things that were well planned and well executed, with patience and with the right people on the right side. It was arriving with the weight of 40 days of darkness and reconstruction, of a coffin in Asheville and a peach tree in Hickory, and a bird that sang on the fence knowing nothing. It was coming. Richard left Arthur's office earlier than Brian and stood on the sidewalk for a moment, with the Charlotte sun hitting from the side and the busy street around him, people with the habitual hurry of those with schedules, not knowing there was a man there who had been clinically declared dead 40 days ago. He had changed. He knew that with the clarity of things that cost dearly. He had spent decades building an empire convinced that success was measured in assets and influence, and he had discovered inside a coffin that it was measured in who appeared when everything collapsed, in who acted with nothing to gain, in who stayed when leaving would be easier. It wasn't about the plan. The plan was on track, but there was something in those weeks in Hickory, in the shared silence, in the conversations of no strategic importance that he wasn't ready to end. Brian reached the sidewalk and stood beside him for a second, looking at the same stretch of street as old friends do. "How are you?" Brian asked. It wasn't the question about the plan. It was the other one. "I'm different," Richard said. "I don't know yet if better or just different." "The two things usually go together," Brian said. "They take a while to separate." Richard nodded. They were silent. Then Brian said he had a meeting and left. Richard stayed a bit longer on the sidewalk, listening to the noise of the city, and then followed, still with the cap, the beard, and the fake name, because he had learned inside a coffin that invisibility is a form of power most people never consider. The coming week would be the last of this parallel life, and after that, the other life, the real one, with his name, his face, and the weight of a man who returned from where one does not return, and now knew what to do with it. The legal notification arrived at Sterling Manor on a Monday morning. Richard knew this through Brian, who knew through Arthur Light's office, which had filed the documents the previous Friday. The notification was technical, dry, filled with the impenetrable jargon the law uses when it wants to say something grave without sounding dramatic. Petition for declaration of nullity of death certificate based on proven irregularity and cautionary suspension of all legal acts resulting therefrom. It was a grenade, with the pin pulled. And Vanessa and Marcus knew it had been thrown, but they didn't know by whom or from where. Brian had put 2 trusted men on the street in front of the manor. Not detectives, not security guards, but acquaintances of his from the construction business, discreet and with good judgment, to observe the movement. Monday's report was one of agitation. 2 cars that entered and left. A long call Vanessa made from the gate with her cell phone in hand, Marcus appearing and disappearing from the office in short intervals. The pattern of someone who received news and doesn't know how to process it. On Tuesday, Arthur Light received a call from Vanessa's lawyer asking for clarifications on the nature of the petition. Arthur replied only that the case would follow its normal course and that any clarifications would come through the appropriate channels. "She's scared," Brian said on Tuesday night's call. Her lawyer sounded nervous. "It's time," Richard said. The meeting was set for Thursday afternoon in the boardroom of a neutral office in downtown Asheville that Arthur had reserved under the pretext of mediation. The invitation was sent to Vanessa and Marcus through legal language that left it implicit that cooperation would be beneficial for everyone, the language lawyers use when they want to say the alternative is worse. They showed up. Richard was in the room when they entered, but they didn't see him immediately. He was with his back to the door, looking out the window at the main street of Asheville. With the gabled roofs and colorful banners the city insisted on keeping year-round, as if the outside world could be kept at a distance by sufficiently charming decoration. He heard the door open. He heard Vanessa's footsteps, that walk he had learned to recognize without needing to see, the mid-heels she preferred for events that mixed formality and comfort. He heard Marcus's heavier footsteps behind her. He heard the silence that happened when she saw him. Richard turned slowly. Vanessa stood motionless 10 feet from the door. The color had left her face with a completeness he had never seen. Not common shock, not the startle of an unexpected encounter, but that specific whitening of the body that recognizes an impossibility materializing before it. Marcus, behind her, kept his hand on the doorknob for a second, as if evaluating whether it was better to keep coming in or retreat. "Richard," Vanessa said. The voice came out as if she herself didn't believe she was using that name at that moment, in that context. "Vanessa," he said. And there was in his voice a calm that had taken 47 days to build. Not the forced calm of someone holding back rage, but the genuine calm of someone who had passed to the other side of something and no longer needed to carry the weight of carrying it. Marcus closed the door. There was on his face an expression Richard recognized from the business world, the expression of someone calculating exits and realizing the exits are closed. Arthur Light was sitting at the head of the table with a closed folder before him. On the other side of the table, Brian stood up when Richard turned, not as a dramatic gesture, but simply because he was the kind of man who stands when a friend enters the room, regardless of the circumstances. "Please sit," Arthur said, with the neutral courtesy of professionals who conduct difficult situations without losing their composure. Vanessa sat. Marcus sat. Their lawyers, who had arrived earlier and stayed quiet in a corner, sat as well with the rigidity of those who realize the game they thought they were playing is different from the game that is actually happening. What followed lasted 2 hours. Arthur presented the documents in order: the hospital chart, the financial records catalogued by the accountant, the technical report from Dr. Henderson confirming that Richard had been admitted to the hospital in a state consistent with poisoning by a paralyzing substance, the history of the Florida case documenting the previous pattern, and lastly, with the precision of someone who knows the last piece is the one that closes the argument, the recording made by Mrs. Higgins in the living room of the manor. When Vanessa's voice came out of the recorder, that southern drawl, that tone of someone saying things they believe have no witnesses, her lawyer closed his notepad. Marcus looked at the table. Vanessa looked at Richard. And it was in that look that Richard found the answer to the question he had carried through all those days. Was there, at any point, anything real between them? The answer was on Vanessa's face now. There was no heartache, no remorse, no trace of what exists when one loses something that was once true. There was only the accelerated calculation of someone evaluating consequences. The answer was no. And in a strange way, that answer hurt less than he had imagined it would. When Vanessa and Marcus's lawyers asked for a break for private consultation and left the room with their clients, Brian approached Richard and stood beside him in silence for a moment. "How are you?" he asked, for the second time in a few days. "Relieved," Richard said. And it was true, not the effusive relief of the movies, not tears or the triumph of someone who won a battle. It was the quiet, almost domestic relief of someone finishing cleaning up a mess that had been accumulating for a long time. When the lawyers returned, they brought the settlement proposal Arthur had already expected: recognition of the certificate's irregularity, return of all values moved after its issuance, immediate removal of Marcus from any role linked to the Sterling Group, and cooperation with the investigations the authorities would start from the case. Richard looked at Arthur. Arthur nodded slightly. It was what they had planned to accept. "I accept," Richard said. Vanessa didn't look at him when she signed. Marcus didn't either. And Richard realized he didn't need that look. There was nothing those looks could give him that he hadn't already found in the last 47 days. On a roadside with 2 strangers, in a kitchen smelling of coffee, on a Charlotte sidewalk with the sun on his side and the best friend in the world by his side. When he left the office and the cold Asheville air hit his face, he stood still for a second. The street was alive around him. Tourists, the smell of wood-fired pizza from an open window, the colourful banners swaying. The city was exactly what it had always been. He was the one who was different. He took the phone from his pocket and dialed. Sarah answered on the third ring. "It's over," he said. There was a brief pause. "How was it?" she asked. "How I needed it to be," he said. And then, because the time had come to say what had been left unsaid, "I'd like to have dinner with you. Not as a debriefing, not as a formal thank you. Just dinner." Another silence. Shorter. "I know a good place in Hickory," she said. "Then tell me the address," said Richard Sterling, and for the first time in 47 days, he truly smiled. 3 months later, Richard Sterling returned to Asheville. Not for the manor. The manor was in the process of being sold, a decision he had made without hesitation and without melancholy, because places that carry false memories don't deserve the energy necessary to transform them. He returned for the city, for the pines that framed the streets like vegetable sentinels, for the morning mist that descended from the valley and made everything seem slightly unreal, for the coffee in the gabled bakeries where the waiters still recognized him and said with genuine surprise that they had thought he had gone away never to return. "I'm back," he would say, and let the sentence be simple. The Sterling Group had gone through a full audit under the supervision of Brian Salz, who had taken over as interim CEO during the months the case stabilized. The numbers the accountant had found were confirmed, documented, and reversed to the extent legally possible. The company had survived, shaken but intact in essence, which was the structure that 30 years of work had built. Mrs. Higgins had been invited by Richard to return to her position with a salary adjustment and a handwritten letter. She carefully folded and put in her bag without saying a word, which, for those who knew her, was exactly the equivalent of a long speech. Dr. Alden Vance had cooperated with the authorities, as Arthur had predicted, and the case followed its natural course through the slow and inevitable paths of justice. Richard had learned in those months that justice is rarely fast, but is frequently consequential, and that there was a specific peace in trusting that work to those who were paid to do it and dedicating his own energy to what he knew how to do. Build. Caleb Miller had received, without Richard giving advance notice, a generous deposit in an account Brian had discreetly located. Caleb called the next day to say it hadn't been necessary. Richard said he knew, that he had done it anyway. There was a pause, and then Caleb said he was going to use part of the money to fix the asphalt on the stretch of road where the van had stopped. That stretch the county never fixed. Richard said it was a good idea, and it was. Sarah was in her 4th year of nursing school. They had had dinner in Hickory 3 weeks after the meeting in the Asheville office, in a restaurant with rustic wooden tables and a small menu the owner updated according to what the suppliers brought that day. The kind of place that doesn't appear in travel guides and that people who live in a city keep for themselves as a private secret. She had arrived on time in a different blouse than the ones he had become accustomed to seeing, and he had realized it was the first time he saw her outside the context of those difficult weeks. They had stayed 2.5 hours. They talked about nursing school, about Caleb and his particular philosophy of life, about Asheville and Hickory, and the differences between the two towns that were so close geographically and so distinct in spirit. They talked about what had happened, without needing to give it more space than it deserved. It was a story. It was important. It had happened. And there were other stories too. At the end of dinner, when she went to get her coat, he said, "Can I see you again?" She was silent for a second, with that way of hers of processing things before responding. "You can," she said. It was a small response that held within it everything he needed to know. On that morning in Asheville, 3 months after everything, Richard Sterling walked down the main street with his hands in his pockets and the cold air in his lungs. There was something different in the way he crossed a space now. Less urgency, less of the mental trot of someone always managing 10 things at once, more the presence of someone who learned, in the most drastic way possible, that every step on the ground is a privilege that can end. He stopped at a bakery, ordered a coffee, stood in a corner observing the street. There were tourists taking photos of the roofs. There was a couple arguing with the lightness of people, who still have their whole lives ahead of them to argue. There was a dog sleeping at the entrance of a shop, as if the whole world were his property. There was the normal and beautiful noise of a city that existed independently of any private drama that unfolded within it. Richard Sterling had awakened inside a coffin and had come out of there with something that no amount of money and no success had managed to give: clarity on what in fact mattered. He had come out with the knowledge that there were people in the world who opened caskets on roadsides because it was the right thing to do, that there were friendships that survived anything because they were built on something more solid than convenience, that there was a bird on a fence in Hickory that sang every day at the same time, knowing nothing, and that there was something of an instruction in that. He had come out different. He had come out lighter in some places and heavier in others, as he had told Brian. He had come out with scars that didn't show on an X-ray, but that he felt when he woke up in the early morning and needed a second to remember where he was. And then he remembered, and breathed, and went back to sleep. He had come out alive, and it was enough. It was, by far, enough. He finished his coffee, paid, and left. The street was waiting, with all its glorious normality. Richard Sterling walked through it with his lungs full of the cold Asheville air toward the next chapter, which would be, like all the next chapters from now on, entirely his own. Dear listeners, if the story of Richard Sterling touched something inside you, if the silence inside a coffin, the loyalty of a roadside, and the reconstruction of a man who returned from the impossible made you hold your breath or let out a sigh of relief, then know that this is exactly what this story was created for, to remind us that even in the darkest shadows there is the possibility of a light, and that sometimes that light comes in the hands of those we least expect. If this narrative was worth your time, leave a like. It's the simplest way to say this journey was worth it. If you haven't subscribed to the channel yet, do it now. There's much more waiting for you. Stories that will surprise, move, and make you think. And in the comments, tell us, which character from this story stayed with you? Caleb, who opened the casket because it was right? Brian, who answered on the second ring? Or Sarah, who said, "You're safe now," and meant it? We read everything. We're here. See you in the next story.